Anthony Albanese holding a news conference. The Labor Shadow Cabinet has been meeting down in the South Coast bushfire-affected regions. Let's have a listen in.
Stopping at Braidwood and Nelligan on the way here from Canberra. And this morning in Mogo, we had breakfast in one of the cafes there. We visited the confectionery shop. We visited the Indonesian shop that's there on the main street of Mogo. And we talked to locals and we talked to visitors alike. It's good that we met a whole busload of retired people who've come from a retirement village in Campbelltown to contribute to the economy here on the South Coast. And we'd encourage more people from Sydney, from Canberra, from Melbourne to come, not just to here, but to Gippsland, to the Blue Mountains, to the North Coast, to areas that have been doing it tough. We've heard firsthand from small businesses that they need assistance. The restaurant that we had dinner in last night had put in an application for support. This is a restaurant in Bateman's Bay, Stingrays, that opened up their restaurant for people to sleep on the floor during the crisis here. This is a restaurant that is community-minded, but the truth is that its business dried up at what should normally be the most busy time of the year. They filled in their applications. It was in great detail, and the person who runs the restaurant is a former chartered accountant. He knows how to fill in a form. He filled in the forms, he sent it off, many pages, and got back saying now the program's changed and he has to fill in more forms. One of the things that we've heard from people is we need to cut through the red tape. Small businesses need cash flow. Today we heard from Warren Sharp from Eurobodalla Shire, who told us firsthand in a very emotional way how tough it was dealing with the bushfire crisis here. The actions of people like Warren saved lives in this community, lives of locals, lives of people who are visiting the region under enormous pressure. And I just pay tribute to the inspirational heroes of this community, people like Warren and others, people from the RFS, the emergency services, people who made such an incredible difference during this difficult time. And of course we know that in spite of the fact that we do have some rain today here, the crisis is far from over. In terms of the bushfire season, we need to bear that in mind as well. But with regard to recovery, the big message that we have is that timing is important. Small businesses have reached the end of January not being able to pay their bills. They need cash flow. They need that income support. Individuals need that income support as well. They also need support in other areas, and today we had a submission at the Shadow Cabinet from Chris Bowen, our Shadow Minister for Health, which spoke about mental health and other health issues, and we adopted again a 4-point proposal, constructive suggestions to the government for practical measures that they can make. And I'd ask Chris to outline what those measures are. We'll advance those again to the government as we have during this crisis. We've put forward practical measures, whether it was the increase in aerial firefighting capacity, whether it was the need for a national response to what was a national crisis, whether it be increased use of the Defence Force, increased support for mental health, ecological audits, support economic compensation for income lost for volunteer firefighters. All of these issues have seen Labor put forward constructive suggestions to the government, and we'll continue to do that. But I do want to say that Fiona has done her community proud in the representation that she's made, the commitment she's had working tirelessly day in, day out, alongside people like Mike Kelly in Eden Monaro, Darren Chester in Gippsland, and Susan Templeman in the seat of Macquarie and the Blue Mountains and the Hawkesbury. All of these members have worked so hard on behalf of their communities, and Fiona deserves every recognition for the work that she's done, alongside the amazing volunteers and people like Warren, who presented a discussion to the Shadow Cabinet today. Chris?
Thanks very much, Albo. I think all Australians understand that the bushfires have been a public health emergency, and just because the flames may have subsided in many areas, the emergency hasn't ceased. It's an ongoing health challenge for the country and needs an ongoing response. As Anthony said, in Adelaide in early January, we, on behalf of the opposition, made a series of constructive suggestions to the government in terms of the health response, and we acknowledge that they accepted several of those ideas and adopted several of those suggestions, but not all. And so today we renew our call on the government to enable telehealth rebates in all bushfire-affected areas. The government did adopt that for mental health consultations, but of course, while that's welcome, it's a much broader challenge. And here, for example, on the south coast of New South Wales, there are GPs in major centres like Batemans Bay and Ulladulla, but many of the towns that are so severely affected don't have GPs, whether it's the hamlets like Lake Conjola or Borley Point and other places where people don't necessarily have the capacity to visit the major centres. They should be able to have telehealth consultations with GPs and other health professionals across the board, not just mental health. So we renew that call on the government. The second point is that headspace is very important for young people and young people's mental health, particularly here in bushfire-affected areas, and some specific calls. Here in Batemans Bay, we need a full-service offering headspace facility urgently. The government and the Labor Party both went to the election saying that Batemans Bay will get headspace. The government has previously said one will be provided by the end of this year. We need it urgently here. If you're a young person who's got some mental health challenges which are related to the bushfire in particular, or broader mental health issues, you're not going to get in the car and go to Nowra or Bega to visit a headspace. We need a full-service offering headspace here in Batemans Bay, and also in Katoomba there's a satellite, a small headspace, that needs a full-service offering as well, which I've discussed with Susan Templeman, the member there. The final point I'd make is that there are other changes the government is making to GPs in particular, which will have a negative impact, particularly on bushfire-affected areas, and we're calling on the government to review their decision across the board, but with particular focus on bushfire-affected areas. And there are two examples I want to give. The government's changing the districts of workforce shortage to make it harder for some areas to attract GPs and doctors who are overseas trained and who have restrictions on where they can work. For example, the capacity in Nowra and Bomaderry and Ulladulla has been removed, and I've had feedback from GPs in Nowra, Fiona has, to say this will make providing medical services in these areas so much harder, that it will challenge the viability of their practice not to have those doctors available. That must stop. And the government, Ministers Hunt and Colton, need to reflect on how these policies are impacting on bushfire-affected areas in particular, as well as across the board. The other one is the rural bulk billing incentive, which the government is removing from a number of regional areas. Again, I've spoken at length with members of parliament like Joel Fitzgibbon and Meryl Swanson and Justine Elliott, who've made the case to me that this will have a negative impact on their areas, several of which have been bushfire affected. Again, there's been correspondence between me and Minister Hunt. I call on the government to review their decisions to remove those bulk billing incentives in regional areas. Yes, rural and remote areas need bulk billing incentives to get doctors. Of course they do, but so do regional areas. It's hard to attract doctors to many regional areas. It's hard to get bulk billing in those areas. And the last thing those areas, particularly bushfire-affected areas, need is to have their bulk billing incentives removed or reduced. So these are, again, as Anthony said, as we did in Adelaide, constructive suggestions made in good faith to the government. Just as the government accepted several of our proposals in January, we call on them to accept these proposals we're making today.
Thanks very much, Chris. Happy to take questions.
Mr Albanese, Scott Morrison this week accused you of trying to politicise the bushfires. Are you trying to capitalise on this?
Well, I didn't do an ad during the bushfire crisis. The Prime Minister authorised an ad on behalf of the Liberal Party during the bushfire crisis with background mood music use of Defence Force imagery and a donate to the Liberal Party button on that ad. What I've done, and people will judge me by this, is I have put forward constructive suggestions going back many, many months. The Prime Minister has chose to try to politicise it. Bear in mind, the day that that ad appeared, he had time to do the ad. He didn't have time to ring Shane Fitzsimmons, the head of the New South Wales Rural Fire Service, and tell him about the change in government policy.
On another matter, Barnaby Joyce and some of his rebel National MPs have threatened they could cross the floor. Is Labor going to seek to try and exploit this?
Well, the Coalition are a mess. That's the truth. The Coalition are divided. They're incapable of providing the sort of leadership that this nation needs. One of the reasons why we have a complacent and arrogant government sitting there doing nothing is that they're internally constrained on the economy, on wages, on climate change, on energy, on so many issues. We simply don't get leadership and a response from this government. We get a she'll be right, mate approach from Scott Morrison and his team. My concern isn't the impact on the Coalition, frankly. That's their business. My concern is the impact on the country. And the division is holding back the country. It's why we don't have a climate change policy. It's why we don't have an energy policy, and why they're complacent about an economy that was struggling well before any of the crises that have appeared in recent months, well before. And this is an arrogant government. And when you don't stand for things and don't have a plan going forward, when you get through an election campaign with not much policy, but just by saying, well, we're not Labor, then that's not enough to actually govern the country for 3 years. And Scott Morrison has a plan for political tactics every 24 hours. He doesn't actually have a plan to take the country forward. He has a plan for marketing and for, political tactics. But there's no strategic approach to the country. And Barnaby Joyce is stepping into that vacuum and holding the country back. Remember this about Barnaby Joyce. The last time Barnaby Joyce was on the hunt, he changed the nature of the coalition. We had leadership changes at both the Liberal Party and National Party level, and an absolute crisis internally in the coalition. But that was when they were in opposition. But that is one of the reasons why we've had the years of inaction on climate change and energy policy. Now he's on the hunt again, with Matt Canavan riding shotgun in the Senate. That has real implications for the coalition government and its unity, but it has unfortunate implications for the government and for the nation.
On the reports about the $150 million female facilities and water safety stream program, it's been revealed today that 40% of that $150 million program went to two marginal seats that the government were trying to retain, Pearce and Corangamite. The government says this was simply an election promise. Does that pass the pub test?
Well, it doesn't pass the pub test. Look, this is sports rorts on steroids again. The fact is that what we've seen here is a program with no guidelines, $150 million of taxpayers' money abused for political purposes, where the only guidelines were the electoral map and the political interests of the government. This is a government that is obsessed by its own political interests and has forgotten that it's there to look after the national interest. This is a government that treats taxpayers' funds as if they're the funds of the Liberal and National parties.
What do you think this does to...
Anthony Albanese starting to get into a bit of the politics of the day there as well. Labor, for your information, has just held shadow cabinet there on the south coast of New South Wales. You can keep watching this, by the way, skynews.com.au on Extra One. So head to our website if you'd like to keep watching the Labor leader there speaking after that shadow cabinet meeting. A few suggestions in particular about how to try to get some of those areas going affected by the bushfires, having been through a few of the local areas as well. A breakfast meeting there apparently also.